Odyssey has just gained a 200% increase in its daily active players, mainly due to Nolan's The Odyssey. But this made me realize something I had never seen before. The game is getting massive love and praise despite being the most hated entry in the series for quite some time. And since the fanbase is now open to some level of critical thinking, I decided to talk about the reasons why this game received far more hate than it deserved, especially at launch, and what could have been added to fix it. But I'm sure that at the back of your mind, you'll all agree with what I have to say. This isn't the issue just with Odyssey, but it was with almost every Assassin's Creed that came between 2018 and 2023, where people complained that despite having the name Assassin's Creed, the game doesn't feature any assassins, which is obviously a valid criticism, but most of these complaints came from the people who sadly are not that invested in the lore. Because here's the thing, while the hate was justified to some degree, they were missing the point that this game literally takes place in 432 BCE when the assassins didn't even exist. Bayek created them in Origins in the year 42 BCE, roughly 300 years after the events of Odyssey. So how could there be an assassin in this timeline? The thing is, they were actually looking to explain the first civilization lore a bit deeply, and yeah, I know how they also managed to mess up some of the things. There's no denying that the game included a lot of the cool stuff too that fans wondered for a long time. Some notable examples include the hybrids, the interpretation of Isu as mythological deities, and their ruins. While we were exploring these structures, the feeling of the classic game to some extent returned, which made me more curious about what is there to come. But the criticism spiraled, especially when fans learned that for the first time in the series' history, there would be no hidden blade whatsoever. Instead, Cassandra will have the broken spear of Leonidas. Although it had its own significance in the main story, but people didn't care. People entered the game expecting the same stealth and parkour formula with a strong, linear, and tighter narrative. But when they booted the game up, they got to know that the game isn't what they were thinking, mainly because of the name Assassin's Creed, which led to the game being hated even more than it actually deserved. What could have been done was to make the game titled Odyssey an Assassin's Creed Adventure or something like that. That would have made more sense. It would have also justified the massive scale, the lack of assassins, and the lack of hidden blade. But as we know, that didn't happen, which amplified the massive hate it got, and what could have been fixed by a simple change got worse. From a sales perspective, they did what they could to maximize their profit, but even if it was marketed a bit differently, then maybe the hate would have been way less. Don't get me wrong, the choice gave players a greater sense of freedom, and back then, most players generally preferred male protagonists over female ones. The problem is that this character selection diluted the original experience the game was trying to deliver. For years, people were genuinely confused about who the canon protagonist was, and the novels confirmed it was Cassandra, yet the marketing suggested otherwise. Almost every promotional image, trailer, and even the cover art featured Ezio, which led many fans, including me, to choose him during our first playthrough. But that was only part of the issue. Ezio's dialogue delivery and even his voice often felt out of place and at times forced. As a result, many players overlooked the incredible performance delivered by Cassandra's voice actor. People ended up criticizing Alexios heavily, and because there was no option to switch protagonists mid-playthrough, we were stuck with that choice for the entire story. Over time, many felt that he worked far better as a villain than as the main protagonist. Later, during the Ubisoft controversy, we learned that this decision was deliberate, as higher-ups reportedly believed that women don't sell. That led to Cassandra receiving far less promotion than Alexios, despite the story being written around her from the beginning. What could have fixed this was simply making Cassandra the sole playable protagonist. Female leads absolutely work when handled properly, and doing so would have allowed Ubisoft to flesh her out even further instead of spending resources duplicating the same role for Alexio. I understand what they were trying to achieve. They wanted players to feel immersed and feel as though the story was truly their own. But that kind of vision takes years upon years to perfect, not a development cycle of 3 to 4 years for a project this ambitious. You know what I mean, right? Ironically, they made the same mistake with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but only in reverse. In that game, I personally think the male Eivor actor is the stronger performance and the version that feels canon. But in Odyssey, they really dropped the ball with this forced animus gender choice. It ultimately added very little to the experience, and only now are many people playing the game as it was originally intended and realizing just how much work was put into Cassandra as a character. If only that had happened when the game was first announced. This was actually a valid issue, and one that I personally agree with wholeheartedly. If you've been watching me for a long time, then you'll probably know that I love playing games as a completionist. But with Odyssey, they took things way too far. The map they crafted was beautiful, the colors, the saturation, the landscape, the islands, everything was designed to grab your attention. The problem was that the map was simply too big. It featured almost the entirety of ancient Greece, including nearly every major region, island, and city that existed during that period. Now, there's a difference between a map that is huge and exciting to explore and a map that is huge but feels like an absolute chore to complete. Odyssey unfortunately fell into the second category. While the world was undeniably breathtaking, it was also filled with repetitive structures, recycled objectives, and choices that rarely had any meaningful impact on the world or side content. Instead, what we got was a world that looked alive on the surface but often felt flat underneath. Every region was packed with hundreds of activities, yet very few of them felt rewarding. More often than not, they felt like digital labor. Ancient Greece offers countless opportunities for storytelling and world building, but instead of making exploration feel natural, Ubisoft turned it into a checklist. The gameplay loop was simple once you understood it. Complete a side quest, clear a location by checking off its objectives, and continue the main story. And that exact same formula was repeated across almost the entire map. Now, Origins wasn't completely different in that regard. It followed a similar structure, but it never felt as forced. A big reason for that was the writing and the way the game presented its quests. Even many of the smaller side missions featured properly animated and in some cases motion captured cutscenes that elevated the experience significantly. A lot of that was missing in Odyssey. Part of the reason was the choice-driven dialogue system, which often came at the cost of more handcrafted storytelling. And despite all those choices, many of them had little to no impact on the world and sometimes barely affected the story itself. Had Ubisoft taken more time, refined the exploration, and focused on creating memorable content instead of simply creating more content, the game could have been much stronger. Instead, we ended up with a grind-heavy experience that makes me hesitate every time I think about replaying Odyssey. There's just so much to do that it can feel overwhelming unless you have an incredible amount of free time. Thankfully, this is one area where I think Valhalla improved. Its collectibles felt more enjoyable to hunt down, and its world events were shorter, more focused, and often far more memorable. If Odyssey had adopted some of those ideas, I honestly wouldn't have minded the skill nearly as much. For some people, this might not seem like a major issue, but coming from Origins, this was one of the things that genuinely frustrated me: the constant enemy level scaling. In Origins, it worked very differently. If you outleveled a region, let's say it was recommended for level 5 players, and you later returned a level 20, that area would still remain level 5 for the rest of the game. Do you get what I mean? There was an actual sense of power progression. I remember returning to Siwa after finishing the story and absolutely obliterating enemies just to see how much stronger Bayek had become. It was satisfying because the game acknowledged your growth, but Odyssey handled things differently and it really annoyed me. Now, I'm not saying level scaling is inherently bad. Some players enjoy having a constant challenge and that's perfectly fine. The problem is that we already had difficulty options, including nightmare mode for players looking for that extra challenge. We didn't need every enemy in the world scaling alongside us as well. It sure made sense for elite Spartans or Athenians to become stronger over time, but why were random bandits in Cephalonia reaching absurd levels simply because Cassandra did? And don't even get me started on the animals. At that point, the system stopped feeling immersive and started feeling artificial. In my opinion, Ubisoft failed to create a compelling difficulty system here. I genuinely don't know who came up with the idea during development, but my dude, you deserve the brazen bullet treatment for this one. It became so frustrating that even fighting basic enemies felt tedious. Enemies that I could dispatch with ease in Origins suddenly turned into damage sponges. The whole system felt like an attempt to force players into experimenting with builds, engravings, and specific perks. And personally, I wasn't a fan of that approach. At the very least, they could have included a setting that completely disabled level scaling. The game already offered a huge number of customization options, so adding one more wouldn't have hurt. Because here's the thing, Cassandra is essentially a demigod. Yes, there are builds that can make her feel incredibly powerful, but most players don't have the time or the patience to hunt down specific gear pieces, rare engravings, and optimal perk combinations just to experience that fantasy. And honestly, the system completely ruined the sense of progression for me. The more I leveled up, the more it felt like I was staying at exactly the same power level. No matter how strong I became, enemies were always right behind me, usually only a few levels lower at most. That creates a weird disconnect where normal enemies and major bosses start feeling far too similar in terms of challenge. And for many players, it became one of the biggest reasons why Odyssey felt more exhausting than rewarding. Most of us are sick of this issue at this point, and since it became a recurring problem in modern Assassin's Creed games, there was no way I was leaving it out. Not gonna lie, its roots can be traced back to earlier AC titles as well, but for some reason it felt far less noticeable back then, mainly because those moments usually happened while we still had control over the camera. The best example of this is once again Origins. That game also had scenes where characters simply talked without elaborate animation, but those moments were usually placed at the end of quests or before major cutscenes. Because of that, they never felt particularly out of place, and most importantly, many side quests still feature properly motion capture scenes, especially the more significant ones. So the problem was never procedurally generated cutscenes themselves. The problem was how they were used, how often they were used, and where they were placed. In Odyssey's case, the vast majority of the story relied on them. The camera would zoom in on Cassandra's face, she would stand in a fixed pose, background music would play, and that was pretty much it. Literally, that was the formula. There were only a handful of fully motion capture scenes, and unsurprisingly, those are the moments most people actually remember. Because as I've mentioned several times throughout this video, repetition was one of Odyssey's biggest weaknesses. After a few hours, you could really start to feel it. The issue became even more apparent because it didn't do justice to the performances of the voice actors. Cassandra's voice actor delivered an incredible performance, but the facial animations and character expressions were so robotic and lifeless that even great voice acting struggled to compensate for them. That's why so many scenes, whether they were emotional, funny, dramatic, or romantic, ended up feeling strangely similar. And why did this happen? Because of the RPG dialogue system that the game was built around. Some people will point to games like The Witcher 3 and say they did something similar, but that's exactly the problem. Odyssey adopted elements of that style without matching the same level of presentation. There's a massive difference in execution between the two games, and The Witcher 3 still featured far more handcrafted cinematics than most RPG-style Assassin's Creed titles. Thankfully, this is one area where Ubisoft seems to have listened to the community. Due to years of feedback and criticism from fans, there are strong indications that future titles are moving away from this approach and putting a greater emphasis on cinematic storytelling again. Hopefully, when Assassin's Creed Hexi arrives, this won't be nearly as common, because Ubisoft themselves seem to understand how much this style can hurt the emotional impact of a story. And honestly, if Odyssey had featured more handcrafted cutscenes and fewer repetitive dialogue sequences, I think the game would have been received far more positively at launch. And that's it for today's video. We hope you guys loved it, and if you really did, then make sure to let us know in the comment section below. Subscribe for more content like this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Till then, goodbye.